She ran barefoot through the storm, chased by a man who once called her his wife. When she finally collapsed by the river, the stranger who saved her hadn't spoken a word in years. The wind tore at her hair as Lydia stumbled through the dark, the river whispering somewhere ahead like a promise she could not yet see. Her bare feet struck stones and frozen roots, leaving smears of blood across the pale ground, but she kept moving, clutching the torn shawl tight around her shoulders. The ranch lights flickered far behind her, swallowed by the rain that came slanting across the plains in cold, wild sheets. She did not know where she was going, only that every step carried her farther from the man whose anger had turned their house into a trap. Her breath came hard and shallow, tasting of iron and smoke, the memory of gunfire still ringing in her ears. She had heard the bullet strike the doorframe as she ran, close enough to feel the splinter of wood graze her cheek. Now the lantern swung from her hand, its flame trembling against the wind, showing glimpses of the land like brief flashes in a nightmare. A dead fence post, a mule's skull, a patch of wet sage. She pressed forward, guided by the faint roar of water, and the thought that if she kept near the river, she might find a town, or a camp, or anyone who wasn't him. The storm thickened until the world narrowed to what the lantern could reach. Her husband's voice had always been loud, even in silence, even when he wasn't in the room. She could still hear it, curling in her head, calling her useless, calling her his, promising that no one else would have her. But something in her had broken free tonight, not with a scream, but with a quiet certainty that she would rather die running than live one more day chained to his shadow. Her hands shook as she climbed a rocky slope, the rain soaking through her thin dress, her teeth chattering so hard she bit her tongue. Lightning split the sky, revealing the valley below, the river twisting silver in the flash before darkness fell again. She slipped once, caught herself on a branch, then pressed on, the sound of hooves in her memory, though none followed. The world smelled of wet earth and fear. By midnight her lantern sputtered out, leaving her wrapped in blackness so complete it felt like being buried alive. She stumbled until her legs gave way and sank to her knees at the riverbank, her body shaking from exhaustion. The current hissed past, cold and endless, and she dipped her hands into it, letting the water sting her cuts clean. She wanted to cry, but no tears came. There was only the steady thud of her heart and the storm's growl overhead. Somewhere far behind, the life she had fled was burning out. She whispered a prayer, not for safety, but for strength, and rose again, barefoot and trembling, following the river's curve toward the unseen mountains. When dawn finally touched the clouds, she was still walking, her eyes hollow, her spirit bruised, yet somehow alive. The sky was the color of pewter when Lydia felt the horse falter beneath her. Its sides heaved, foam streaking its neck, and before she could pull the reins tight, the animal's legs gave out. She hit the ground hard, breath leaving her in a rush, her knees sinking into cold mud. The horse tried to rise once, then stilled, its breath turning to fog that vanished into the morning. Lydia pressed her hand to its neck, whispering sorry, though she did not know if she meant for the beast or herself. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of thunder. She could hear the river nearby, swollen from the storm, calling to her like a living thing. With the horse gone, she had no choice but to walk. Her shoes had long since torn apart, her dress clinging heavy with dirt and blood, her body a map of bruises and scrapes. Each step sank deep into the wet ground. The canyon walls rose around her, red stone streaked with shadow, the path narrowing until only the river offered passage. The current looked faster than she remembered. It twisted between rocks, frothing white, carrying branches and scraps of driftwood. She followed its edge, hoping it would lead somewhere, maybe to a trail or a trapper's road. The water's voice grew louder, filling the canyon until it seemed to speak her name. She leaned close, trying to drink, but the mud slipped beneath her. In an instant her body plunged forward, the river swallowing her whole. The cold hit like a fist. She gasped, lungs filling with icy water. The current seized her, dragging her under, spinning her through foam and stone. She reached for anything solid, but her hands found only emptiness. Panic burned through her chest as she broke the surface for air. Choking, her hair plastered to her face. The current pulled harder, carrying her downstream between jagged cliffs that tore at her clothes. She tried to swim, but her limbs were too heavy, her strength too thin. The river didn't care who she was or what she had escaped. It simply took her. When she woke, the world was quiet. Her body lay tangled in reeds at the bend of the river. Sunlight poured weakly through the trees, touching the water with gold. She tried to move, every muscle screaming. Mud clung to her hands, her hair stiff with ice. For a moment she thought she was alone, until a shadow shifted across her face. She blinked against the light and saw a man standing over her, tall and broad, his coat dark with rain. A rifle hung across his back, its barrel glinting. His eyes were pale gray, unreadable. When she opened her mouth to speak, no sound came, only a hoarse breath. The man crouched beside her, his face calm but scarred, and when he turned his head she saw the marks across his throat, deep and old, the kind that told her he could not answer even if he wanted to. Lydia's world swam in and out of light as the stranger lifted her from the reeds. His arms were strong, but his movements slow and careful, as if she were something fragile that might break with too much handling. She tried to speak, to ask who he was, but her throat only scraped out a sound like gravel. He didn't answer, only nodded once and began walking, his boots steady against the uneven ground. The forest closed around them, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Lydia's head rested against his shoulder, her vision blurred with exhaustion. Each step felt like being carried deeper into a dream she couldn't wake from. When he finally stopped, she saw the faint outline of a cabin, rough, hewn logs pressed tight against one another, smoke curling thin from the chimney. He pushed the door open with his boot, the hinges groaning, and the warmth inside met her like a wave. He laid her gently on a cot by the fire, covered her with a wool blanket, and knelt beside her with a small tin bowl. Steam rose from melted snow. He dipped a cloth into it and began to wipe the dirt from her face, pausing whenever she flinched. His silence filled the cabin, not cold or cruel, but deep, like a place where words had drowned long ago. When she whispered "thank you," he looked up and met her eyes, then pointed to his throat, dragging 2 fingers across the scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone. Understanding came slowly. He could not speak. She turned away, ashamed of the pity that rose inside her. He went on tending her wounds, grinding dried leaves into a paste that smelled sharp and clean, spreading it over her cuts with steady hands. When she woke again, it was night. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows against the walls. She sat up weakly, her body stiff, and saw him sitting across the room sharpening a knife, his expression calm, almost distant. Above the hearth hung a small piece of wood, carved with a single word, Eli. She whispered it aloud, testing the sound. His eyes flicked toward her, a small nod confirming it was his name. Lydia studied him in the flickering light. The worn coat, the calloused hands, the quiet gravity that clung to him. He moved like a man who'd been alone for too long. When he saw her shiver, he stood, added another log to the fire, and pushed a tin cup of warm water toward her. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a heartbeat. He did not pull away. Lying back, she tried to decide if she had been rescued or taken. The door was bolted from inside, the woods too thick to cross alone. But as the flames rose, she watched him settle by the hearth, his face soft in the light, and a strange calm spread through her. For the first time in years, she was not afraid. The storm did not end for 3 days, snow falling in soft, relentless waves that buried the world beyond the cabin. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and pine, the fire whispering in its steady rhythm. Lydia slept through the first day, waking only when Eli pressed a cup of broth into her hands. His eyes asked questions his mouth could not form, and she answered with small nods, too weak to speak much. On the second day she rose, her legs trembling, and walked the room in slow circles. The cabin was small, but built with care, a table of rough pine, a single shelf lined with jars, a worn Bible with a broken spine, and a rifle leaning near the door. Every corner told her this was a life made by one man and silence. Eli moved through it easily, his steps quiet, his gestures precise. When he needed to tell her something, he would write on scraps of brown paper the words simple and neat: food, rest, safe. She began to look forward to those notes, their simplicity, a comfort against the noise of memory. By the fourth day she could chop wood beside the cabin, her hands blistered but steady. Eli watched her from the porch, his face unreadable, and when she slipped, he stepped forward to steady her, but stopped just short, as if remembering that she might not want to be touched. She thanked him anyway, her voice rough from disuse, and his eyes softened in response. It became their rhythm, her words filling the space, his silence answering. Sometimes he smiled faintly, a brief flicker that vanished too fast, yet each time it warmed something in her chest. She found herself speaking just to hear another human sound, telling him small stories from her childhood, about a river and a pie her mother once burned, about how the sky could feel like a lid pressing down on her when she lived under her husband's rule. Eli never interrupted, never looked away. At night the wind howled like a wounded thing outside. Lydia dreamed of fists slamming against doors, of broken plates and screams swallowed by the dark. She would wake choking, her hands gripping the blanket, and each time she opened her eyes, Eli was there by the door, rifle across his knees, watching the window as if he had sensed her fear before she did. His presence steadied her, though they never spoke of it. Sometimes she wondered what silence had cost him, what words he had lost along with his voice. She caught herself tracing the scars on her own arms, thinking how pain marked them both, just in different shapes. When the snow finally eased, light poured through the cracks of the shutters, turning the room gold. Lydia stood at the window, her breath clouding the glass, and for the first time since she ran, she did not think of escape. She thought only of how quiet could feel like safety. The morning sun filtered through the cabin window, thin and pale as frost. Lydia sat at the table, watching Eli mend a broken snare. His hands moved with the calm precision of someone who had learned to survive through quiet patience. She wanted to ask about the scar that crossed his throat, wanted to know what story had stolen his voice, but the question clung to her tongue for hours before she let it go. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. He froze, the bit of wire still between his fingers, and after a long pause, he touched the jagged line beneath his jaw, then looked away toward the door. She waited, heart thudding, but no answer came. When she whispered that she was sorry, he shook his head, a single, gentle motion, the kind that said no pity, no need. The silence after felt heavier than words but not cruel, only full of things neither of them knew how to say. That day she worked harder than before. She swept the snow from the roof, her arms aching as flakes drifted down around her. Inside, she cleaned the hearth, patched the blanket, and stirred the stew until the scent of rabbit and herbs filled the air. She wanted to repay him somehow, though she doubted anything she did could balance the weight of what he had given her, safety and kindness without demand. When he returned from checking the traps, his boots caked with ice, he paused at the doorway and watched her set the table. She smiled awkwardly and said she hoped the stew wasn't too thin. He took a spoonful, nodded once, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw gratitude flicker in his gray eyes. In the evenings they sat across from each other by the fire, the air between them steady and warm. She began to understand his gestures, the way he tilted his head to ask if she was cold, the small motion of his hand That meant he would go for water. He started writing fewer words, trusting that she could read him without them. Sometimes, she caught him studying her, not with hunger or claim but quiet wonder, as though he were trying to remember what it meant to share space with another soul. The thought both comforted and frightened her. One night she found him outside, staring at the mountains washed in moonlight. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. She stood beside him, the silence thick but not empty, and for the first time she felt it might be enough. When he glanced at her, she smiled faintly and whispered that maybe some stories were meant to stay unspoken. His breath fogged in the cold as he nodded, eyes soft with understanding. Together they stood without words, the quiet around them no longer a wound but a bond they both could live inside. The morning was clear and still, the kind of quiet that came after long storms. Lydia stepped outside to gather wood, her breath clouding in the cold. The forest felt endless, its pines black against the pale sky. She followed the sound of crows until she found a fallen log and began to split it with the small axe Eli had shown her how to use. Each swing steadied her, the rhythm of work pushing away the thoughts that sometimes crept in when the world grew too still. She carried the pieces back to the cabin, her arms trembling from the weight, and knelt to stack them by the hearth. While reaching for the last log, she noticed a metal corner sticking out from beneath the cot, dull and rusted. Curiosity stirred before caution could stop her. She pulled it free, wiping the dust away until a small tin box appeared, its lid bent from years of use. Inside was a single photograph, yellowed at the edges. A man stood between a woman and a small child, all three smiling in sunlight. The man was younger, clean, shaven, but she recognized the eyes at once. Eli. The sight of his face before the scar stole her breath. The woman beside him was beautiful in a simple, open way, her hair braided, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The child, a girl no older than 5, held a wooden toy horse. Lydia stared at it until her throat tightened. She did not hear Eli enter until the floor creaked behind her. When she turned, the photograph still in her hand, his face changed. For a heartbeat, his body went rigid, then his hands clenched into fists before slowly relaxing. She began to apologize, words tumbling out, but he raised one hand to stop her. His eyes were dark, not angry, but full of something older than anger. He reached for the photo, his fingers trembling, and placed it back in the tin without meeting her gaze. Then, he took his coat and left, the door closing softly behind him. The hours stretched long. Lydia tried to keep busy, mending clothes, feeding the fire, waiting for the crunch of his boots outside. Snow began to fall again, thin flakes drifting like ashes. When he finally returned, it was near dark, his face drawn, his coat smelling of pine smoke and grief. Without a word, he crossed the room, set the tin box on the mantel, and opened it. He lifted the photograph, tapped the woman's face, then made a slow motion downward, like covering something with earth. Lydia watched, the meaning clear, though no words were spoken. She swallowed hard and nodded. Loss lived here too. He looked at her then, a silent thanks passing between them. She stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on the table, not touching him but near enough for warmth to bridge the distance. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a memory too heavy to die. The storm came without warning, rolling down from the mountains like a white wall that swallowed sky and earth alike. By nightfall, the wind screamed against the cabin, shaking the shutters until snow forced its way through the cracks. Lydia and Eli worked in silence, stuffing rags into the gaps and hauling the last of the wood inside. The chimney groaned, the fire struggling to breathe beneath the gusts. Outside there was no horizon, only whirling white and the low moan of the storm. Inside, the air turned heavy with smoke and fear. When the roof began to leak, Eli climbed onto the table to wedge a piece of hide against the beam, water dripping down his sleeve. Lydia held the lantern for him, her fingers numb, her eyes following every sure movement of his hands. When he climbed down, they looked at each other, and both laughed quietly, a sound that felt strange and good amid the fury outside. Days blurred together, light and dark meaning nothing. They rationed the last of the flour into thin cakes, boiled snow for water, and shared what little rabbit meat remained. The world beyond their walls no longer existed. At night the cold crept close, despite the fire, and they were forced to share the narrow cot wrapped in blankets, their breath mingling in the dim light. At first, Lydia lay stiffly, afraid to move, but Eli kept to his side, his stillness respectful, his warmth steady. After a while she stopped thinking about right or wrong, and simply listened to his heartbeat under the layers of cloth, its calm rhythm easing her restless mind. When the wind roared, she told him stories. She spoke of summers by the river, when the water shimmered like glass, of her mother humming old hymns while hanging linens to dry, of how the house had once smelled of bread before her father died, and her mother remarried the man who turned her life into silence. Eli listened, his hands motionless on the blanket, his eyes fixed on her face as though her words built a world he could step into. Sometimes he smiled faintly. Other times he reached for the tin lantern to add light so she would keep talking. When her throat grew raw, she whispered that she was tired, and he would write one word on a scrap of paper, rest, then fold it neatly and slide it under her palm like a promise. As the blizzard raged, time lost its edges. The walls creaked, frost spread along the windows, and every sound outside felt like something waiting. Yet inside, something soft had taken root. They spoke little but understood much. When the fire burned low, he would sit close to tend it, his face glowing orange in the light. She would watch him until sleep came, thinking how strange it was that in a world so full of cruelty, comfort could be found in silence and a stranger's steady breath beside her. The morning the storm broke, the world seemed too quiet. Snow hung heavy on the pines, the air sharp and bright after weeks of gray. Lydia stepped outside, the sunlight almost painful against her eyes. For a moment she believed winter's siege had passed, and peace might follow, but then she saw them. Boot prints, deep and fresh, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. Not Eli's. These tracks were heavier, the heel worn on one side, a drag in the left step. She knew them before her mind could admit it. Her heart began to hammer, and the sky seemed to tilt. The mountain that once felt endless now pressed close, trapping her. She turned toward the cabin, snow crunching underfoot, fear running through her veins like cold iron. Inside, Eli was already standing by the window, his rifle in hand, his eyes sharp with warning. She whispered one word, "Husband," and he understood. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his movements sure and silent, and handed her a bundle of blankets, motioning for her to hide beneath the trapdoor near the hearth. She shook her head. The idea of crouching in the dark, while another man decided her fate, made her stomach twist. She had hidden enough in her life. Eli's jaw tightened. He pointed again, more urgently, but she stayed where she was, her hands trembling yet firm. Outside, a crow called, a harsh cry that echoed through the still air. Eli turned back to the window, the muscles in his neck rigid, his silence sharper than words. She moved to his side, gripping the table to steady herself. The tracks led straight toward them. Somewhere below the ridge, a horse snorted, the sound faint but close. Lydia's mind, filled with memories she had tried to bury, the crack of leather, the slam of doors, the bitter smell of whiskey on his breath. She had run once, but running hadn't freed her. Her husband was close enough to smell, close enough that the air itself carried his presence. Eli's hand brushed her arm, not to comfort, but to anchor her. His eyes asked if she was ready. She nodded. They waited. The minutes stretched thin. The wind stirred the trees, and a shape appeared on the edge of the clearing. A man wrapped in a dark coat, moving slow, scanning the cabin. Lydia's body shook with a strange calm. Fear had burned itself into something hotter. Fire. She stepped forward, But Eli caught her wrist and shook his head. His look begged her to stay back. When the figure reached the porch, boots crunching, Eli lifted the rifle, his breath steady. The man's voice cut through the stillness, rough and mocking, calling her name like a curse. Lydia flinched, then squared her shoulders. The door rattled under his hand. She whispered, "No more hiding," and Eli lowered his rifle just enough to meet her eyes. In that brief moment, the silence between them became a vow. The sound of hooves shattered the still morning, each thud breaking through the hush that had held the valley for days. Lydia stood near the door, her fingers clenched around the edge of the table, listening to the drunken shouts that rolled through the trees. Her husband's voice, thick with rage and whiskey, cut through the air like a blade. He called her name, stretching it into a threat, promising what would happen when he found her. Eli had already slipped outside, his steps soundless over the snow. She wanted to follow, but fear rooted her in place. Through the narrow window, she saw movement among the pines, a dark figure stumbling from his horse, gun drawn, eyes wild with hate. Her breath came shallow, her mind a storm of every memory she had tried to forget. Eli appeared from the shadows, silent and deliberate, his rifle raised, but his expression calm. He moved like part of the land, the snow barely crunching under his boots. Her husband spun toward the motion, firing wildly. The gunshot cracked against the cliffs, scattering birds into the sky. Lydia screamed, though she could not hear it over the thunder in her chest. Eli dropped low, returning fire once, twice, his movements clean and practiced. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the sharp scent of pine and smoke. Her husband cursed, firing again, the bullet tearing through the cabin door. Lydia ducked, splinters grazing her cheek. She crawled to the window, heart pounding, eyes searching through the drifting snow. By the creek below the slope, she saw them face each other, two figures framed by white and silence. Her husband staggered, reload clumsy, shouting words that dissolved into the wind. Eli did not answer. He moved closer, each step measured, his breath forming small ghosts in the cold. The final shot came sudden, echoing off the stone walls of the canyon. The world went still. Lydia burst from the cabin, slipping on the frozen path. Her hands scraped raw as she ran toward the creek. The snow was stained red in thin streaks where Eli knelt, one hand pressed to his side, the rifle fallen beside him. A few feet away, her husband lay motionless, face down in the drift, the gun half buried in ice. She dropped beside Eli, her voice shaking, asking if he was hurt bad. He pressed his palm to the wound, blood seeping between his fingers, and shook his head once as if to say, "Not yet," not enough to stop him. Lydia looked at the other body, the man who had haunted her steps for years, and waited for the rush of triumph that never came. There was only silence, the river whispering beneath its skin of ice. She leaned her forehead against Eli's shoulder, tears falling hot on his sleeve. The storm inside her broke at last, leaving only the hollow ache of freedom bought with blood. Night closed over the cabin, heavy and endless, the wind outside whispering through the trees like ghosts that would not rest. Lydia worked by the light of a single lantern, its glow trembling over Eli's bare shoulder, where blood darkened the cloth beneath him. He sat still on the cot, face pale, eyes fixed on the fire, while she cleaned the wound with shaking hands. The bullet had grazed him high across the shoulder, deep enough to bleed hard but not to kill. She pressed a rag against it, her own breath quick and uneven. The sight of blood no longer frightened her, only the thought of losing him after all he had given. When she threaded the needle and began to stitch, her hands trembled so much she could hardly guide it through the skin. Eli didn't flinch. He watched her quietly, his jaw set against pain, his eyes soft with something that felt like understanding. When it was done, she tied the last knot and sat back, wiping her face with her sleeve. The smell of iron filled the air, sharp and bitter, and her stomach turned. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice raw. "I never should have brought him here. I've done nothing but drag death behind me." Eli turned his head slowly toward her, his gray eyes catching the firelight. He reached for the small tin box beside the bed and pulled out a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil. She waited while he wrote, the scratching sound faint but steady. When he handed it to her, her heart stilled. The words were simple. "No, sorry, you live." Her throat tightened as she read it again, tracing the uneven letters with her thumb. "You live," she repeated softly, as if testing how the words felt in her mouth. He nodded once, the faintest hint of a smile pulling at his lips. It was then she understood that his silence wasn't emptiness. It was a choice, a vow not to speak, unless the words carried something worth more than breath. He had turned his pain into stillness, and in that stillness he had built a kind of peace she had never known. She changed the bandage, careful not to touch more than needed, though every instinct in her longed to. When she rose to pour water from the kettle, her legs felt weak. The night outside pressed against the window, black and endless. "You should sleep," she whispered. But he shook his head, motioning for her to rest instead. She lay down beside the fire, exhaustion pulling her under. Before sleep claimed her, she felt his hand brush lightly against her arm. A quiet "thank you." When morning came, pale light slid through the cracks in the shutters. Eli still sat upright, the wound bound tight, his eyes watching the snow drift past the window. Lydia rose slowly, her heart sore but steady. She no longer felt like a burden. She felt alive. And that, she realized, was the price they had both chosen to pay. The mountain changed with the coming of spring. Its harsh white softened into streams of silver and green. The snow sank away day by day until the dark soil showed through, damp and rich. Lydia woke each morning to the sound of dripping water from the eaves and the crack of ice breaking loose from the creek. The air smelled new, carrying the sweetness of pine and thawed earth. She began to clear the patch of ground behind the cabin, her fingers sinking into mud that clung beneath her nails. Eli watched her from the doorway, a faint smile touching his mouth. When she looked up and asked what he thought, he knelt beside her, picked up a small stick, and drew in the dirt, his lines spelling one word she knew well now: grow. She laughed, the sound light as the wind, and together they turned the soil until the day fell quiet again. Each afternoon they worked side by side. He built a fence from branches. She planted seeds saved from the winter stores. Wildflowers pushed through first, blue and yellow, fragile and bright. They looked like forgiveness, and Lydia whispered as much when she saw them. Eli reached for his notebook, writing 3 words before turning it toward her. "Flowers remember light." She felt the truth of it settle inside her chest. In the evenings they sat on the steps as the sky turned gold, the world stretching wide and alive around them. Eli began teaching her signs, slow and patient, shaping her hands with his when she fumbled. Sky, he showed her, sweeping upward. River, tracing a wave through the air. Heart, his fingers curling to touch his chest. She repeated them until he nodded with approval. Sometimes he added new ones, inventing gestures for laughter or warmth, and she joined in, their hands moving in a quiet rhythm that felt more like prayer than language. Travelers came now and then, trappers or traders passing through, their horses splashed with mud, their voices carrying through the valley. They stopped for water, curious about the pair who lived there. Some called out greetings, mistaking them for husband and wife, and Lydia always smiled but never corrected them. Eli's eyes met hers across the yard, calm and knowing, and she saw no need to explain. What they shared did not fit the world's words. It lived somewhere between silence and breath, a bond held not by promises but by choice. When night fell, the sound of the river filled the cabin, steady as a heartbeat. Lydia would lie awake sometimes, thinking of the road she had taken to reach this peace, the pain that had burned her clean of everything false. Beside her, Eli slept, his hand resting lightly near hers, the faint scar on his throat silver in the moonlight. She turned toward him, whispering "thank you" into the dark, though she knew he didn't need to hear it. He already understood. The first light of summer came slow over the peaks, brushing gold across the snow that lingered in the shadows. Lydia stood outside the cabin with a shawl over her shoulders, watching mist rise from the valley. The air smelled of river water and pine, clean and sharp, the kind of morning that made the heart ache from its own quiet beauty. Behind her the door creaked, and Eli stepped out, his coat hanging loose, his hair damp from the basin. He moved beside her without sound, the boards soft beneath his boots, and together they watched the sun climb higher. It had been months since the snow melted, months since blood and fear had ruled their days, and the silence between them had grown into something sacred. Lydia no longer feared it. She had learned to live inside it, to hear meaning where no words were spoken. The world beyond the valley seemed far away now. Travelers still passed sometimes, leaving stories and rumors that drifted off like smoke. They brought news of wars, gold, and lawless towns, but those things felt small compared to the steady rhythm of this place. Lydia tended her garden, Eli hunted and mended traps, and each night they met by the fire where the light flickered over the carved letters of his name. They no longer needed the scraps of paper he once used. Their language had become glances, gestures, and the simple exchange of trust. When she looked at him, she saw the life that had been rebuilt from ruin, not through words, but through patience. This morning something stirred in her chest, an ache both sweet and heavy. She thought of the woman she had been, the one who ran through the storm barefoot and terrified, and she almost couldn't believe she had survived her own story. She turned to Eli, his face calm in the sun, the faint scar along his throat shining pale. The thought rose unbidden, and before she could stop herself, she spoke softly. "You don't need a voice to be heard." He looked at her then, eyes steady, the corner of his mouth curving into a small, uncertain smile. For a long moment, there was only the wind moving through the grass and the slow pulse of the river below. Then he drew a breath, deep and careful, and a sound came from him, low and rough, a single hum that trembled in the air. It was broken, uneven, but real, and it carried across the clearing like a promise. Lydia's hand went to her mouth, tears filling her eyes as the note faded into the morning. She stepped closer, touching his arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's enough," she said. He nodded, the light catching in his gray eyes, and together they faced the rising Sunday. They had not found safety or perfection, but something better, a home built from silence and understanding, where even a broken sound could mean love. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.